Chapter 7. A Moose, a Nerd, and the Who's. Ted's joy at the end of World War II was cut short by the death of his sister, Marnie. Because of a family quarrel, she and Ted had fallen out of touch. She died before they could make up. Her death upset him so much that he avoided talking about her for the rest of his life. Now that the war was over, Ted and Helen decided to stay in California. They bought an old observation tower on a mountain outside La Jolla, a beautiful California town on the Pacific coast. For years, the tower had been empty, and it was a favorite meeting place for young couples. The walls were covered with carved initials. Even after the Geisels moved in, some couples would still try to come inside. One of Ted's first books after the war was Thidwick and the Big-Hearted Moose. Thidwick is too nice and let other animals push him around. At the end of the story, Ted asks readers, "Well, what would you do if it happened to you?" Ted ended many of his books this way, by asking questions. He wanted kids to enjoy his stories, but he also wanted to help them think for themselves. Ted began to turn out 1 or 2 books every year. They were funny, original, and very different from one another. People often asked Ted where he got his ideas. He said that he usually started by doodling. "I may doodle a couple of animals. If they bite each other, it's going to be a good book." After a while, he got tired of this question. He started saying that he got his ideas from people in a small town called Uberglench. "I go there on the 4th of August every summer to get my cuckoo clock repaired." From then on, he gave this answer to everyone, even President John F. Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline. Some of his books were inspired by the real world. In 1953, Life magazine sent Ted and Helen to Japan to find out how the country was coping after the war. Ted had mixed feelings about the Japanese. In his wartime cartoons, he had shown Japanese people, even U.S. citizens, as villains. But as he talked to teachers and school children in Japan, he got past this prejudice. He saw that the people of Japan were trying to honor the importance of each individual and still work together for the common good. Back in his studio, Ted explored what he had learned in Japan. To do this, he returned to one of his most beloved characters, Horton the elephant. In Horton Hears a Who, Horton must save the tiny world of Whoville by proving it exists. He can do this only by getting every Who, even the very smallest and laziest, to work together. Horton is willing to risk everything for the Whos because a person's a person, no matter how small. Ted dedicated this book to a Japanese friend. By the time Horton Hears a Who was published, personal troubles had taken over Ted's life. Helen was suffering from a terrible illness. She could not breathe on her own and had to be put in an iron lung, a huge metal case that enclosed most of her body. Ted spent hours sitting beside her in the hospital. When she came home, Ted rigged up mirrors so Helen could watch their dogs playing outside. Ted had relied on Helen for everything. She helped him with all his books and ran his life for him. Without her, he didn't even know how to balance a checkbook. Helen amazed her doctors by recovering almost completely. In May 1955, she was able to travel back to Dartmouth with Ted to see him get an honorary doctorate. Years ago, he had disappointed his father by not earning a degree from Oxford. But now, he had made up for it. He was no longer just Dr. Seuss, he boasted. He was Dr. Seuss. The first nerd. Ted loved to invent words like thneed and salamalagu. One of his words escaped from its books and became part of the English language. Dr. Seuss was the first person to use the word nerd. If I Ran the Zoo, published in 1959, young Gerald McGray plans to sail a catrue and bring back a nerd. No one knows quite how it happened, but within a year, teenagers in Detroit were using nerd to mean a drip or square, and soon the new word had spread across the whole country. Chapter 8. The Cat in the Hat Arrives. In 1954, an article appeared in Life, a popular weekly magazine. It asked why American children had so much trouble learning to read. Was it because books for beginning readers were so boring? Teachers thought children learned to read by seeing the same words over and over, so early readers used short, choppy sentences that just kept repeating the same thing. Why would smart children read these dull books? If someone like Dr. Seuss wrote an early reader, maybe children would actually want to read it. A friend of Ted's, William Spalding, worked for the publisher Houghton Mifflin. He read the article and said to Ted, "Write me a story that first graders can't put down." Ted was willing to try. Random House and Houghton Mifflin worked out an agreement. Houghton Mifflin would sell the book to schools and libraries, and Random House would sell it to bookstores. William Spalding gave Ted a list of about 300 words that most first graders should know. The book could only use about 225 words, and all of them had to come from this list. Ted thought it would be easy to toss off a little story, but he soon found out it was almost impossible. Every time he had an idea, he needed a word that wasn't on the list. He spent more than a year trying and failing. Finally, he decided, "I'll read the list once more, and if I find 2 words that rhyme, that will be my book." He found them, cat and hat, and The Cat in the Hat was born. The Cat in the Hat was published in 1957. Many teachers didn't like it. They thought it looked too much like a comic book, and it wasn't serious. Some librarians hid it and hoped kids wouldn't find it. Houghton Mifflin, which handled school and library sales, didn't sell many copies. But kids loved The Cat in the Hat. They read it and told their friends about it. Bookstores couldn't keep it on the shelves. It just kept selling and never stopped. Within 3 years, it had sold over 1 million copies. Of everything he had written, Ted said, "It's the book I'm proudest of." At Random House, Bennett Cerf's wife, Phyllis, thought The Cat in the Hat should just be the beginning. He wanted to publish a whole series of books like it. Books that used just a few words but were so much fun kids would actually want to read them. She convinced her husband to let her start a new company at Random House. It will be run by Phyllis, Ted, and Helen, called Beginning Books. It would publish beginning readers by Dr. Seuss and also by other people. Right away, Beginner Books was a hit. Random House became the nation's largest publisher of children's books. Ted was happy to publish books by old friends from his Army days, like P.D. Eastman, who wrote Are You My Mother and Go Dog Go. He also published a book with Marshall McClintock, the Vanguard editor who had given him his start years before, and he discovered books about a family of bears written by Stan and Jan Bernstein. Bennett Cerf was amused by the word list Beginning Books authors had to use. If writing a book using only 300 words was so hard, he asked, what about one with even fewer? He bet Ted $50 that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. Bennett Cerf lost his bet. Ted wrote and illustrated Green Eggs and Ham using exactly 50 words. It remains the most popular of all his books and 4th best-selling children's book of all time. The Baby Boom. Beginning Books began at the best possible time. After World War II, American families started having lots of children. By 1957, there were more kids just learning to read than ever before. At the same time, the United States was more and more afraid of the USSR, a group of communist countries. People were worried that schools in these countries were better at training children to become scientists and inventors. So in 1958, the U.S. government began to pour money into schools and libraries. Some of the money was used to buy books like Dr. Seuss's Beginner Books series.